Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Thursday morning's webinar on this lovely, grim and rainy morning in Cork City here. I'm Chloe Tetra, I'm the health coach here with ReadyCare, and for this morning we're going to be exploring how your brain tricks you, or rather how to maybe go about it so that your brain starts to trick you a little bit less and you have a little bit more awareness around how it's tricking you and what you can do to counteract it, basically. So even though the brain is this absolutely amazing mechanism, I would say, it's absolutely brilliant, very, very complex, but it's absolutely riddled with false assumptions, perceptions, and beliefs that can skew our engagement with the reality around us, ourselves, how we view people. So if you're like most people, you can really recognize this in others. You can see, yeah, there's lots of people out there operating on biases. There's lots of people that are very prone to stereotyping, lots of people that are prone to thinking errors, group thinking, and echo chambers. And what I mean by echo chambers is people that only surround themselves with people who agree with them. But if you're also like most people, when you turn that inwards, you go, oh, but not me, though. Absolutely not. I am a beacon of mental clarity. And that is exactly where the cognitive errors is coming into. It's this kind of blind spot that we all hold when it comes to our first person perspective on reality, how we view our own ability to think clearly, and how very cleverly our brain puts little blind spots for all the little shortcuts that it does. It's like a little worker that's like, don't look over here, shortcut. So basically for today, we're going to have a look a little bit at what these thinking errors are, how they, why they came about in the first place. It's not our brain just being very mean to us. It never is, God love it. It's doing its best most of the time. And some of the most common examples of thinking errors that can come in. And really from today, what I would aspire to is for people who are listening to this, who are interested in how to make the best of their own critical thinking, how to move forward with the understanding that there are particular shortcuts that the brain takes. And what would it be like if I was interested enough to go, okay, since I know that this is, this kind of vast and pervasive thing that happens in brains and people of all walks and sizes, how might this be influencing me? And how might I leverage some of the awareness to be really curious about myself and really practice a bit of self-awareness to go, is there a way that I can do a little bit better in terms of how I want to show up in the world and the quality of the decision making that I want to put forward? So going back to basics, what are cognitive biases? So they're kind of the shortcuts, as I said, to our decision making and judgments. So they're these kind of systematic patterns or deviations from our normal way or rational way, which I don't really think exists. I think we're just made up of these altogether, where subjective reality influences our preferences, our beliefs, and there's a big gap with objective truth. Quite a noticeable one. Now, most people are viewing the world through their own lens anyway. So objective truth is very difficult for most of us to grasp. We'll always be wearing the lens of our own perception with this. But these particular biases, they really skew our perception and lead us to make decisions based on skewed information or preconceived notions rather than facts. So the roots of cognitive biases come evolutionary. They developed as a mental shortcut, which people in IT might be familiar with the terminology. In neuroscience, it's also called heuristics. So linguists use the term heuristics and people in programming. And it basically means a shortcut. So it's this equals that, how to get that kind of gap in. And it's to facilitate quick decisions in an environment where speed trumps accuracy in decision making. So with the brain, there's this tendency to see patterns in random information, one of which will be confirmation bias, which we'll go into in a while. This would have helped early humans detect things like danger, and would have helped to veer off potential dangers, even if it meant sometimes mistaking something like the wind for a predator. So basically, it's trying to protect us all the time by taking a leap in the future, predicting based off these particular patterns and shortcut keys, for want of a better word, that we have lodged in. So these biases are at play enormously today, and they do guide our choices in ways that we're very, very unaware of. And I mentioned that kind of blind spot for ourselves. I mean, we're very good at spotting it in others, but when it comes to turning that lens inwards, like, boop-a-doo, not me. So anything from investments with people we trust. Cognitive biases can lead us to overly trust that person rather than the facts in front of us. So a lot of these type of things can lead us astray. And the analogy that I use as to why is this important is, if we have a little bit of a bias, so a little bit of a leaning in a particular direction, if you think of a rocket launching into space, right? If it has a trajectory and if it's skewed ever so slightly, it doesn't seem like a big problem at that point, but further down the line, it could be veering totally off track. So that's what we're kind of looking to have a look at in terms of, how might I be totally veering off track based on the particular information and patterns that I've collected throughout my life. So how do they come about? And like, a good line that I love that I've popped in here is, the map is not the territory. And this is used an awful lot in psychology. It's used a lot in neuroscience in a lot of different places. And it basically means that what we're operating from, our own cognizance of the world, is a very, very, very simplified version of reality. And of course it would be, because if you had a map with absolutely everything on the map, waters, hills, grass, the amount of blades of grass, the wind velocity, it's overwhelming. You can't really navigate that way. So to simplify things, our brain just breaks something down into a really, really sketchy, in both sense of the words, a sketchy version of reality that we can navigate more easily without using too much energy. So we operate speed over accuracy. And we also operate on this confirmation bias. Basically, is one that comes up an awful lot. It's basically what we already think is true is what our brain veers towards. And like, if we let that sink in for a sec, that's quite profound, insofar as we have a tendency to look for information that constantly confirms what we already think to be true. And when we're operating from things like concepts and models, a concept by default, if we think of the word concept, it's quite a fuzzy word, it's quite abstract, and it can be quite shocking, I guess, for people to really understand that that's actually mostly what we're operating on below the hood of the skull, is a lot of very fuzzy, abstract concepts that we're constantly trying to prove to be true. And that's the kind of leaning tendency with the brain. So working from them can lead us to make massive leaps in cognition that distort our image of the world, ourselves, and the people in it. Hidden pattern, they're hidden pattern that result in mistaking facts and really, really poor, faulty decisions. At the core of the decision-making process, as I chat quite often, is that prefrontal cortex, that part in the front of our brain that makes weighed decisions. And it's responsible for the kind of higher order cognitive processes like judgment, problem solving, and the evaluation of complex information. So that region attempts to process information logically and make reasons decision-making. However, when the brain is, the brain also has this kind of older, more ancient emotional center like the amygdala, which reacts to stimuli. So something quick. It's trying to protect us. What's happening? Okay, quick reaction. It reacts with speed and emotion and bypasses the deliberate processing of the prefrontal cortex. So that kind of two-way process in our neurological framework lays the foundation really for cognitive biases. It's pressing the brain to create quicker pathways it can start to operate from. When we're faced with decisions, especially under stress, or when the information is complex or overwhelming, i.e. the world. When we're faced with the world at large, especially in the internet age where there's an awful lot of information, the brain can't process everything. It's going to zero in on particular things. And oftentimes it will zero in on things it already believes to be true, which can be quite dangerous, especially where stereotypes and opinions of the world, ourselves and others are formed. These heuristics, these shortcuts, then become kind of stored as our automatic thinking patterns, and they're guided by the fear center. And that's quite important, is that a lot of them are guided by fear. So these patterns that served us when we needed them, and they still do in some ways, they can mislead us in modern days because of the complexity of the world, because things are inherently a lot more complex from a cognitive perspective now than they may ever have been. We tend to go back to those shortcuts an awful lot. And that interplay between the emotion responses of the amygdala and the logical, slower, more energy zapping. I was trying to think of a word, but zapping is going to be the word that I go on. That slower processing of the prefrontal cortex can lead to cognitive biases, because essentially we get decision-making fatigue. Our brain is fatigued constantly. So when we have that much information, it goes back to simple. What is a simple roadmap I can utilize here? And that influences our judgments and decisions in ways that we're totally unaware of. So when we understand the neurological basis for these types of cognitive biases, these simplified roadmaps, it helps us to look at, okay, what is the impact that this is having? How am I showing up in the world from these kind of sketchy roadmaps? And how can I potentially do better, basically? So let's have a look at some of the common biases that are out there. I mentioned one of them already, and that's the confirmation bias. That's the one that most people fall very much prey to. And I would actually really encourage, for those that are interested in this topic and interested in bypassing how their brain tricks them constantly, is to search for a listing of biases, because there's a lot of them and I won't have time to cover all of them today, even though I'm talking at warp speed, 3 coffees in capacity. But do have a look at them. There's a really extensive list, and trick yourself into look for evidence of you doing these things, because again, because that bias blind spot, we'll go, I don't do any of these things. But actually trick yourself into looking for as many of these biases as you can on that sheet. So to go through some of them for today anyway. Confirmation bias is the main ones, and it leads us to favor and seek out information that aligns with our pre-existing beliefs. This effectively creates what's now called as an echo chamber, and that reinforces these beliefs, because when we surround ourselves with things that confirm us, we will then see evidence over and over that we're correct, that our world is shaped by people who think like us. And that can be quite problematic, as you may imagine. For example, in finance, that bias can lead investors to overlook critical contradictory marked data, favoring instead information that supports their investment choices, which could potentially result in significant financial losses. In relationships, for example, it can cause individuals to ignore complexities and nuances of their partners and solidify these kind of idealized notions of their partner, and they only want to see what they already believe to be there. I mean, we've all either been there and done that, or can see an example of it somewhere in our lives. And they totally disregard things that are opposite to their views. So that's the big kicker here, is there can be very shouting, what people have now called red flags, yelling to pay attention to them, and we just go, no, this is exactly what I want to see, because it confirms what I already think and believe. So that's a very simplistic way of pushing it, but it has really profound impacts on how we show up in the world and the types of decision-making abilities that we put out there, especially when we are in roles of responsibility, be that at work, be that in a family, be that in a social setting, or to ourselves. So another one that I'll touch on today is an anchoring bias. And that's our tendency to heavily rely on the first piece of information we encounter when making decisions. So, for instance, the initial price of a car can be set as the anchor. And that influences all subsequent negotiations and judgment about value, potentially leading to overpayment. And people in sales are really, really cute where this is concerned. They'll give you the first piece of information, and then you work from that. That's your first piece of information. That's your foundation. And it starts to build the bedrock for the rest of the negotiation. And this is where it's important to know cognitive biases, because you may not be aware of them, but the people who are looking to leverage them are very, very aware of them. So in healthcare, for example, if and it's not done on purpose, but in healthcare, a doctor's initial diagnosis can act as an anchor, and that affects all future interpretations of symptoms, treatments, which might delay the correct diagnosis and treatment. And we do this oftentimes in all walks of life, in all types of scenarios, where the first thing that we've come to becomes the bedrock that we build on. But this might not be the right place to land on in the first place. So another one to touch on is availability heuristics. And that makes us overestimate the importance or the likelihood of events based on how easily they come to our mind. So that bias can skew risk perception in health decisions, for example. Media reports about a health scare might lead people to overestimate a threat while neglecting more prevalent but less reported risks. Again, in finance, recent stock market successes or failures that are prominent in the news can influence investors' perception. I'll actually come back to this and kind of stitch them together to give you kind of look at what a scenario of someone else leveraging your biases might look like in a second. And the other one I want to touch on is a little bit, it's tied to it, and it's called motivational bias. So that's a bias that involves the unconscious influence of your own desires and emotions on your judgment. So that bias can drive us to process information in a way that aligns with what we want. It's similar to confirmation bias, but it's to do with the outcome that we want. And that leads to decision making that justifies what we want to believe rather than what the evidence is supporting. So a person might dismiss scientific evidence, for example, due to a deeper emotional driven resistance to, for example, if somebody says meat is not, a scientific paper might say meat is not associated with dangers in the way that we thought it was, which is coming out a lot now. Somebody who's a vegetarian might go, I'm just going to totally dismiss that because it doesn't align with what I want, with my own belief systems and how I want the world to be. So it's totally after cutting out all of that side of scientific evidence based on what they would aspire the world to be like instead. So that has implications, particularly in how we engage with social issues, where there's a refusal to consider opposing viewpoints, and can create greater polarization and stop constructive dialogue. So I'm talking about it in terms of media, and I'll give an example here, but think about the fact that the example can be superimposed on people in your family that think differently. Very slow to my THs now. And people in workplaces that think differently are in any position where you have to negotiate. So putting a few of those together, I'll give you the case of, for those that are not familiar with it, Cambridge Analytica. So Cambridge Analytica were a company that worked a few years ago, and there's a documentary on that used to be on Netflix. I'm not sure if it is anymore. And basically, it leveraged things like availability bias, so information being more available, information presented first, that primacy or anchoring bias, and the frequency bias. So what they did is they worked to change people's algorithms on their social media, right? The social media was feeding them content that confirmed their belief or that created what we were calling an echo chamber. So what that was leveraged for, essentially in states and in other places in the world, was political. So they were employed by political parties to sway public opinion towards a particular vote based on the content that they were viewing on their social media. They were getting things being brought out more often. That's that frequency bias. So the more often they viewed a particular topic or a particular social stance on a topic, the more it was priming their system. There was repetition with it, availability. It's right there in their hand and their device. And and stereotypes. And the thing with stereotypes that's important is a very, very particular bias that leverages our fear. So we have a tendency to view stereotypes based on a negative experience, either that we've had personally or that's presented to us as a case. And it's one or a very small handful of people involved in a particular group presenting these types of behaviors is leveraged against us, or sometimes we leverage against ourselves to create stereotypes, whereby we take entire chunks of a population or whatever it may be and tar them with the same brush, basically. So in the case of Cambridge Analytica, utilizing the brain's cognitive biases leverage votes in a particular direction, which creates a massive, massive social rupture and a massive, massive social impact. It creates polarization and duality in people's view of thinking, creates an us versus them way of thinking as well. So I just thought that was a very, very interesting. I don't know how it's legal. I don't know how in the name of God these things are legal. I guess there's no precedence for them yet. But it's a very, very interesting case study on how our cognitive biases can be leveraged against us. So that's Cambridge Analytica. They were a company. I don't think they're working anymore. So let's have a look at how we can practically build awareness into our own shortcomings, I guess, with these particular cognitive biases. There's a particular quote from Elon Musk, and take him or leave him for what you may believe about him, but with regards to psychotecture, which is this very bro-tech term, he's very good at recognizing particular ways of thinking. So there's a great quote from him that says, "Take the approach that you're wrong as your bedrock. Aim to be less wrong." So what would happen if I was wrong in this scenario, or I am wrong in this scenario? Let's look at other ways that I could be proven wrong, proven right, and really open your mind up to the fact that you have particular biases where you think you're right constantly. All of us do. All of us do. We all think we're right. Be open to the fact that you probably have a very small sketched version of a roadmap of reality and work from there. So a very practical example of a cognitive bias that I know I very much have a pitfall on, and lots of people do. It's a known fact, and it's called the planning fallacy. And what it is when we are asked to estimate the amount of time that a task is going to take us, almost everybody underestimates the amount of time that it will take. So to have awareness of that, to build awareness of cognitive biases and to counteract them, which is what we're trying to do here, is to overcompensate. So you go, okay, I have a knowledge of the planning fallacy. I'm going to build cushion into, and people know this from their own lives and workplaces, especially, where they'll say, let's build a cushion of time just in case. And that's exactly being aware about the planning fallacy. That's a really practical example of how to counteract something that we have a leniency towards. The best line that I can give, right, is, I'll put it up on the screen there because it's the most important thing, really, if you were to take away anything from today, is consider the opposite. If you're able to build a practice of when you come to a cognitive decision, and I say cognitive decision because there's a difference between something about your personal life in terms of what your heart and your gut tell you, what your values are, with presenting with analytical type of information, cognitive-based information that you want to make a measured decision on. Consider the opposite. What might it look like? And just do it as a thought exercise. What might it look like if it were the opposite? There you're going to broaden your scope of awareness and understanding to encapsulate not only other factors that could come into play, but how you may relate to somebody that may think differently. That's already in the planning phases. So you've just jumped ahead leaps and bounds of people who don't consider the opposite, who don't consider what if I were wrong, what if it were more complex than that. And there's an awful lot of historical examples of, why it's important to not hold so tightly to particular belief systems that we may have. Everyone has beliefs, right? Everybody does. They're very important to a lot of people. But where it's a good red flag for you to start looking and say, oof, could this be influencing my biases, for example? Everyone has beliefs, but if you are extremely attached to something to the point that you really, really resist counter information, or somebody starts to tell you that their opinion's a little bit different, these are likely beliefs that are distorting your cognition. These are beliefs that you're going, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to know about it. Now, it's uncomfortable to have something brush up against something that's important to us. But if we look at, killing in the name of, all these types of historical scenarios that have happened with regards to groups of people, doesn't matter who they are, groups of people that refuse to see nuance and refuse to see a different and opposite point of view. So a few different exercises, and if you're interested in this, and if you're interested in giving yourself the best shot at bypassing how your brain tricks you, you can pause the video and just pop in these particular questions for yourself. So an exercise question is, what recent decision did you make almost instantly? And reflect on the factors that influenced this decision. Right? Something you came to very quickly. And what factors influenced the decision? Could there have been any biases playing a role in it? No, it could have been a very positive decision. It doesn't always have to be in the frame of this is a negative thing. Sometimes, our shortcuts are there to help us, and sometimes they really do help us. But what we're trying to do here is to build awareness around how do cognitive biases come into play. So what recent decision did you make almost instantly? Reflect on the factors that influenced the decision. Could there have been biases? So that's your first question. Your second is, think of a belief that you hold on to really, 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 really strongly. Can you find 3 credible sources that offer a different viewpoint? And that's not you saying, I'm giving up my beliefs. It's just going, okay, there are different viewpoints out there. And this might seem very fundamental, but because it's such a blind spot for us, we operate without it. We operate unknowingly, playing out these biases. So once we have awareness and once we constantly remind ourselves, my brain is operating on shortcuts, left, right, and center, like bandwagon thinking. When we see 6 or 7 people do something and we go, oh, cheapers, yeah, that must be the right thing to do. That's a cognitive bias. Lots of them are in there. When gamblers think, I've had 3 streaks in a row, I'm going to put all my money on the 4th one. That's a cognitive bias. All of these type of thinking errors can lead us down the wrong path. Down the garden path, down the wrong garden path. There are many paths in the garden. And lastly, as a last question is, who in your direct network has a radically different perspective? This is what would I say? Viewer discretion is advised with this one. Who's got a radically different viewpoint on an issue you care about? And plan a conversation with them to explore their viewpoints. In a workplace setting where there's a little bit of a clash, it's really good to build a conversation where you both have the intention to get to know each other's viewpoints better, and just park the idea that this is a personal attack. Now, I've kept the consider the opposite because basically, if I were to wrap all of it up in a nice little statement, consider the I love being able to do this. I'm like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Consider the opposite would be the major takeaway. There's a quote from Lao Tzu. There's a quote from Lao Tzu. Getting notions about myself here. How the brain tricks you. I'll finish up on this because I'm running out of time. There's a quote from Lao Tzu I wanted to finish up for today, which was, "Not knowing is true knowledge. Presuming to know is a disease. First realize that you are sick, then you can move towards health." Right, I'll leave you on that little wisdom now from Lao Tzu for today. That's me for today, guys, on how the brain tricks you. I hope you found this information session useful. And Andrew will be back with you guys next week. And have a lovely rest of your week. Have a lovely Patrick's weekend. And we'll be chatting to you later. Bye now.